Hey everyone, good to see you this morning. When the building that you were sitting in or watching from the screen if you're online, when this building was 3 years old, a guy by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner was giving a speech in Chicago. He's a historian and he was trying to make sense of the first centuries of American history. And he presented what has now become known as the frontier thesis. Meaning that if you wanted to understand American history, according to Franklin Jackson Turner, you had to think about the idea of the frontiers. These worlds that were to be conquered, that the way in which America as an institution was sold to European settlers were come across the ocean, and if you can brave the journey, you can build religious freedom, you can build your best life. Why move to the West? Well, you can get land and find yourself and conquer the varying wildernesses. He said, as the thesis was like the American ethos, the American story had to be understood from this framework if it was going to be understood correctly. Now, it made him a bit of a pop star, in as much as any historian is a pop star. You know, you can think about someone like Yuval Noah Harris today and go, okay, well, you know, he's a name I've heard of. Franklin Jackson Turner became a bit of a pop star in the moment. And because what history books got a hold of were like, oh, well, we know how to package that. And what companies that were advertising, like the Colt Revolver Company, began to go was like, well, we know how to package that. You're going to go brave the wilderness, so you're going to need a little bit of protection against the elements that are going to help you do that. Even railroads and others were like, hey, new frontiers. This actual phraseology you can even find in the speeches of American presidents, even dating into modern times, even to times where we've been alive, right? From Kennedy and the space race to the new frontiers talked about today. Now, Richard Slotkin would say it this way. He's a scholar, a modern scholar. In summarizing Jackson Turner's thesis, America is a wide open land of unlimited opportunity for the strong, ambitious, self-reliant individual to thrust his way to the top. If you are, like some of you go, like, that have ever met, and, if you didn't grow up in the United States, you might go, yeah, that describes how Americans think about themselves all the time. They just don't ever pay attention to it, right? That's what it's like to be on the other side of someone who's, like, drank this water and breathed this air the entirety of their lives. Like this country is a place to, like, conquer and beat the wilderness. By the 1970s, this phrase, attributed to the gold rush and Manifest Destiny and all the things of the like, became known more as the frontier myth. Critics of this theory, as it had kind of fallen out of favor, began to point out some things that I think Jackson Turner knew too, and he was not trying to minimize, but got kind of minimized in the pop culture, like, branding of the thing. One is that for every person that found themselves in westward expansion and exploring the frontier, there were a lot of people that also died and lost everything. Mark Twain once called gold rushes a great way to decrease the surplus population, right? Because, and he's quoting Dickens there a little bit, because what it does is, there's for every person that strikes gold, there's a lot more people that lose everything trying to find gold and maybe die along the way. It also fails to pay attention to how brutally harsh frontier travel was. There was a game when I was a kid called the Oregon Trail that was intended to help us understand that, like, leaving Independence, Missouri and making your way to the Willamette Valley of Oregon was a really dangerous journey that had a variety of things in the wilderness that could kill and destroy you. The frontier thesis becomes the frontier myth in another way because by the 1970s, people were beginning to acknowledge that for every person that kind of found themselves in the wilderness, there were a lot of people that were also killed, lied to, had their land taken, or were exploited in the name of building the railroads. That there was brutal violence in the process of finding ourselves in this story, not to mention a brutal treatment of the environment. You can look at what happened to the American buffalo if you need more information about what happened in the name of westward expansion. So in one sense, we have this entertainment framework, the romanticization of the cowboy. We still wear jeans, which is birthed out of that time period in our history. So we're still like sort of living in the frontier myth a little bit. But we also, I think this is what the invitation is really calling us to consider, that like perhaps both of these things are true, right? Wildernesses, deserts do become places of great innovation and collaboration and in trying to figure out how to mitigate the adverse circumstances and work together to create another life. But for every moment that there's that kind of thing going on, there's also these moments where we see the not great angels of our nature. We see how we might, in the name of expedience, lie, cheat, steal, kill, in the name of self-preservation. The wilderness is a place where we are exposed not just to the elements, but what the elements show us about us. And that is the desert days. That's what we're doing these 6 weeks leading up to Easter. This season of the church calendar that you maybe have heard called Lent, that kind of focuses and that number 40 in the Bible and it sort of looks at these times of testing. What we're trying to pay attention to in Lent is both of those things. How does, in paying attention to the elements that are attacking our lives, the things that are challenging in our story, the wilderness that we may find ourselves in, whether it's 40 hours, 40 years, or 40 days, whatever it is, what are those things they're showing to us about us? Maybe they're showing us that we've got really good people walking with us in our story. Maybe they're exposing to us really unhelpful coping mechanisms. Maybe both. And what do we do with those moments, and how does the love of God arrive in our midst and lead us to that flourishing land? We've been looking at the book of Numbers, and we've been trying to pay attention to the Israelites' 40-year journey into the Promised Land. And what we've been trying to do in this section of Scripture that sometimes is difficult to read, is to see not just what's happening in Israelites' story, but to see what's happening in our story, to see how their deserts are showing us things to us about us in our deserts, and how the love of God is bringing presence and provision as God is leading God's people to that place. And ask that same question of us. We're going to jump right now from where Josie landed us, which was in the end of year 2. We're going to jump to year 40. Which is a bit of a strange thing, but that's kind of what the book of Numbers does. It sort of fast forwards many, many years in the middle. And in case you wonder if you live in the suspicion that perhaps Scott is skipping over the fun stories and the pleasant stories and the great memories and where there was some sort of group sing, no, I'm not. I'll actually summarize it with one verse. Numbers 17, 12 through 13. The Israelites said to Moses, "We will die. We are lost. We are all lost. Anyone who even comes near the tabernacle of the Lord will die. Are we all going to die?" There is a pattern of God provides, things are calm for a moment, the desert exposes something else, there is rebellion, there is outcry, there is outrage, and then where does God show up in the midst of that? So we're now going to jump to the Numbers chapter 20, and we're going to be towards the end of the time in the Promised Land, which is where we're going to land until we get to Easter Sunday. Numbers chapter 20 begins here. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived in the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There Miriam died and was buried. That matters for two reasons. It matters, one, because if you don't know that, you don't know who Miriam is, that's Moses' sister. So there are personal connections now to Moses, people who helped shepherd people out of Israel that are starting to lose their life on this journey, including people that are close to Moses. And maybe this plays in, and this is conjecture, right? But perhaps this could play a role a bit into the thing that we're going to see happen here in this story. But it also is intended to show us that there is now going to be a group of people who have only known the desert. They didn't grow up in Egypt. They didn't grow up as enslaved people. They grew up as the children or the next generation or the grandchildren of enslaved people. And yet, you can begin to see how they are repeating narratives that they haven't actually experienced themselves. Perhaps like in your family of origin. Perhaps like in your story. Where people that didn't even live through a particular thing are impacted by the narrative that's been absorbed in that particular thing, about that particular thing. Let's look forward. Now, there was no water for the community, and all the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? There's no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." So the people that are helping Moses process this initially are dying, and there's a whole new crop of people coming up going, "See, it's just so unfair. The Moseses and Aarons of the world are just not kind to us. They've let us out here, and they're trying to kill us." My suspicion, and pardon me if this is not true of you, is that there are parts of the Hebrew Scriptures you find challenging to read, that you don't find of particular importance to your work week, censuses and genealogies, that the government documents that are laid out here, or how the Israelites are to camp out when they set up their campsite through the journey, that you don't go, "Ooh, well, that makes a lot of difference for my Tuesday." Or these long, lengthy explanations about how festivals are supposed to be carried out. You don't see a huge relevance for your Thursday, though it may help you understand why, if you pass a synagogue, why maybe a particular festival is of import. You may find these particular things challenging to read, but if you've ever wondered why all of that's there, it's for moments like this. For moments where in the desert, there's a new threat, something is going wrong, and the people of Israel are being invited to remember in tactile, kinesthetic ways all of the ways God is for them, God has provided presence, provision, and God is calling them as his people. That whether you're reading a census or a genealogy or a government document or the organizational infrastructure about how the campsite is supposed to work, all of this stuff is intended to evoke a memory. Much like when you get to Thanksgiving Day, right? Even if you aren't waking up to be particularly thankful that day, you go, "Oh yeah, I'm supposed to be thankful this day because people told me I was supposed to be thankful for this day 100 years ago, and I'm going to be thankful on this particular day." There's an entire heritage and history for the people of Israel to remember God's holiness, remember God's character, remember God's presence, remember God's provision, even if it doesn't necessarily feel particularly of interest to you as you're reading it on Tuesday morning. And yet, here's why this matters. And yet, the desert, over and over and over again, despite these elaborate chapters detailing the importance of these things, we're thirsty and we panic. Does that feel at all like yourself? You know sometimes that lashing out at the people around you isn't particularly helpful. You know that blowing up the work meeting isn't going to be particularly good, but it doesn't stop you from doing it. Why? Because you're frustrated and you want to get it out. Right. And maybe that minimizes for you maybe the longer list of frustrations that you feel, but the tension that exists there is one I think you can relate to. Sometimes you know the stuff that you could do about a particular thing to remind you and frame a particular problem a certain way, and yet in the moment you're just thirsty. And you're trying to get the need met immediately. You don't want to do the stuff that requires an effort or energy from you. And so how might we learn something really quickly from the people here in the desert? I think this can point us to a couple of different things. But before we get there, I want to call back to, because we talked about Franklin Jackson Turner, Yuval Noah Harris, who is a modern-day historian thinker. He wrote a book called *Sapiens* that's quite popular. He is not a person of faith, and he has a pretty bleak outlook on the future. And I mention him to you because he said something that's actually fairly insightful on a podcast. He was kind of like, why don't you have a pretty great outlook on the future? And he said this. He said, well, human beings tend to be more interested in the gathering and accumulation of new information than to think about the things more deeply that they already know. Meaning this, right? Intellectually, you know that McDonald's 3 times a day and processed sugars and all that stuff are not kind to your body, but it's not going to keep you from scrolling through Instagram trying to find the workaround that like just justifies why you can continue to do the other thing that you don't know is, that you know is not particularly helpful to you. Like, we're always looking for the shortcut as opposed to thinking more deeply about the thing we know is probably the thing we need to do. And that's why he doesn't have a particularly great outlook about the future, that we want to obsess over the accumulation of new information rather than to think more deeply and more below the surface about the things that we already know to be true. And this is kind of what we've got here in Israel's journey, right? Like the Israelite journey here at this point is we're thirsty again. There's an entire method and methodology to how the people of Israel are to remember God's faithfulness and provision, and yet we just need a new way to have our thirst quenched. So what can we learn here? Number one, I think we can pay attention to that impulse in our own story. Where do we trust in immediate gratification over the thing that will ultimately satisfy us? There are no shortage of things in your life that give you the dopamine hit that you need, that give you the immediate quenching of the thirst, but do not rectify the long-term thing that may be a longing in your story and heart. Right? A hookup could be a convenient way to not feel lonely for the duration of the hookup, but it may not cure the actual impulses and longings and loneliness that is being birthed in you, right? Which leads to the second part. What do our greater longings and thirsts actually point to? The thing that's happening here, there is an immediate thirst, but there's also, you can see it in the Israelite story, a deeper fracture that again is being addressed in the new generation. Is God good? Does God actually care? Is God who God says God is? Or is life in Egypt better? Which leads to this final part. What stories have we absorbed? We live in a place, in a time, where fear and outrage sell. And so people are marketing fear and outrage to you from all directions. And you are always faced with the travails of which story do I believe? Which narrative do I absorb? And if you want to live in a place of outrage and fear, you will find no shortage of outlets for that impulse. But if you want to live in a place of peace, and if you want to live in a place of God's provision, it can be quite challenging to tune out the other narratives. And the people of Israel, now what we've got, not just the initial people who are trying to get getting Egypt out of themselves, we have a generation of kids and grandkids who are starting to emerge that never experienced the brutality of life in Egypt, but are beginning to paint romantic pictures of a life they once had. And that's a good word for us when we think about the narratives we absorb and the stories that we tell ourselves. Well, I'll feel better when I am with someone. Or I would feel better, life would be better if I could just get out of this town. It may be an invitation to see that God is doing a new thing, but it may also be an excuse to stay stuck. What do Moses and Aaron do with this, though? That's what we want to begin to look forward to in our last 10 minutes here. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell face down. The glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, take the staff, you and your brother Aaron, gather the assembly together, speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring the water out of the rock for the community so that they and their livestock can drink. So Moses and Aaron begin well. There's a problem that they can't solve, that they don't have the ability to solve, and so they go to the tabernacle, they go before God, the glory of the Lord appears to them and tells them this is what they're going to do. If this story feels like it's a retelling of another story, if you've read the Bible before, you might go, wait, isn't there like another story like this? Is this just a repeat of the story? You know, because sometimes when you read the New Testament, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you will have different tellings of the same story, right? Different accounts of the same thing that happened. So we might wonder, if we're hearing this text, to go, isn't there another thing that happens another point in time in Israel's story? There is. It's many years prior. It's 40 years prior, and I'll actually show you side by side the two. Okay, so in the current, Numbers 20, 7 to 8. In the past, Exodus 17. Miriam was alive then. In the past, how did God answer this conundrum? The Lord answered Moses, go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile. I will stand there before you and strike the rock at Horeb, strike the rock, and the water will come out of it for the people to drink. We'll pause there. That's 17:6. That's 40 years prior. But what's being asked of them right now? The glory of the Lord's appearing to them. Chapter 20, verse 6. I'm leading you. Don't just operate in your muscle memory. Don't just do what you used to do. Don't just do what you did the last time. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You may wonder to yourself, why does it matter? Well, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:4 that rock is Christ. Like that God is, like there's a holiness to what God is doing here that Moses and Aaron are just blowing off entirely. In the present tense, Moses and Aaron are being told, don't go out there and hit a rock like it happened the last time. This time, go out there and speak to the rock, and the same thing's going to happen. And I already kind of buried my lead because I just told you what they do. All right? Let's see what they do, though, for ourselves. Chapter 20, verse 9. Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. All is well so far. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, pay attention here, so this is where it starts to go sideways. Listen, you rebels, must we bring you out water out of this rock? Then Moses raised his arm, struck the rock twice with his staff, water gushed out, and the community and the livestock drank. So, in God's graciousness, the people get what they want and what they need, honestly. What they need is water. They get it. What they want is Moses and Aaron as their little, saviors. And they get that, too, because Moses and Aaron allow it. They complain about a problem that they perpetuate. You know? But for Moses and Aaron, we've got, a real issue here. And it maybe feels small to you because you're just like, there's no heroin involved. There's no, embezzlement of money. There's no murder here. They didn't kill anybody. What's the problem? The people got what they wanted. And that's what I want to spend the last few minutes thinking about. Because for Moses and Aaron, the desert is not just a place where they encounter the thirst. They're also charged with carrying the burden of those who are, thirsty. And that's a lot. And I don't know every turn of your story, but when I look around the people that call the Foundry their home, there's a lot of you that I talk to and talk with that are charged with and trusted with doing things where you often are carrying the burdens of other people. Whether it's as a friend, whether it's as a son or a daughter, whether that's as a neighbor, whether that's as a teacher or a doctor, or you lead a team. So what can we learn here from Moses and Aaron? Not just in the just good business sense leadership 101, but just in terms of how to care for other people without losing our soul in the process. Number one, to pay attention to what God is doing in our story right now. So I hold to what I said earlier with the people of Israel having a memory, but all of those things are intended to remind us that God's holiness, God's character doesn't change, but the methods by which God is working do change. God might be doing a new thing in our life and our story right now. And if we just operate in a perpetual state of reaction and we don't slow down and pay attention, the glory of the Lord is in front of Moses and Aaron, but when they get back in front of the people, they just start reacting in the old ways. And isn't it possible that like you could have like an aha this morning or a spiritual insight this morning that would be helpful to you and good to you, and you like leave this room sort of charged up? By the time you get to your car, the pressures in your pocket are already choking that thing out of you and just pulling you back to like the old way of doing things. That's a tension for us to manage. It's a thing for us to pay attention to in our story. What is God doing right now? And how has God's holiness and faithfulness in the past given us the space to say, God, okay, open hands. What are you doing in our life today? What are you doing right now? Because I don't want to just be romantically attached to the thing you did 20 years ago, but I want to be open to what you're teaching me and where you're leading me in this moment. Second, we have to beware of pride disguising and masquerading itself as false humility. It is easy to feel sympathy for Moses and Aaron if you lead people and deal with whining. And I'm guessing you do. There are moms and dads in this room. There are grandparents in this room. I mean, just there are bosses in this room. There are neighbors and friends in this room. Like, whining happens at all ages, and petulance happens at all ages and of all expressions, right? We could just get out our notes and start comparing and have a real commiseration sesh if we wanted to. For Moses and Aaron, there's a pronoun here that gets thrown out that is like out of order. Moses says it. He says, must we bring out the water here for you? It's this passive-aggressive way of like, you guys and your nonsense, do we have to do this again? Well, look, can we just acknowledge something? I don't have the ability to swing a stick and call water out of it. I don't have the ability to do some of the stuff that Moses and Aaron were, and here's the thing, like, they weren't the ones doing it. They're the conduit by which it's happening. And to absorb the pressure to be the Savior in this moment expresses itself in this, must we be the ones to rescue you again, but is actually pride. This is not the same guy who in Exodus chapter 4 is like, I don't know, I'm not very good with words, and I've got a really scary story, and I'm not sure who you are. Like, it's not the same guy. He's absorbed the burden and pressures of leadership at this point. Truthfully, if we're honest, he's perpetuating the very thing he's frustrated about. Because rather than doing the thing that's like, look, there's no stick involved this time. I don't have magic hands. It's God providing. He's like, no, he just reacts. And how many times maybe do we see, as we deal with difficult people, maybe some pride in ourselves? Are we carrying things that God has not asked us to carry? And if that's the case, we may be more like Moses here than we want to admit. Let's also pay attention to this, how quickly grief and how unhealthy coping skills can take things like grief and make them contempt. Is Moses wrong to be angry at these people? Is Moses wrong to be grieved by these people? Absolutely not. They are petulant whiners that I just want to scream at most of the time until I see myself in them. Then I'm like, you got to be graceful to those guys. They just don't understand. The problem isn't Moses' expression of anger. It's more about Moses has had some spaces where he could carry that anger properly. But what happens a lot of times, and it's not immediate, But some of the people, when you are carrying burdens that you're not carrying them properly, do you ever tend to resent the people that depend on you? Do you ever just act contemptuously towards people that are just doing what they do? We can want them to change, and we want to create some environments whereby maybe they will. But even as they don't, the thing that we actually have some control over is how we carry the burden of that leadership. And for Moses, all of these things he's carved out, all of these sacred festivals, all of these Sabbaths, all of these are not just invitations for the people of Israel, but for him too. And I think this is a good word for those of us that are trying to make a difference, and we're caring for people, and we're trying to be good parents, and we're trying to be good neighbors, and we're trying to be, helpful to our, to maybe whoever we're caretaking for, that if we don't carry the burdens and responsibilities of that role properly, including processing our emotions in healthy ways, then those things can turn into a harmful contempt, even toward people that we love and are trying to help. I don't like that, but I see it. And then lastly, perhaps the cumulative toll that the time in the desert takes on us. Moses doesn't get to go to the promised land as a result of this. Numbers chapter 12, verses 12 and 13. Chapter 20, verses 12 and 13. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I give them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord and where he was proved holy among them. I want to say two things before we lead to communion. My Enneagram 3, my achiever ending in results, looks at what happens here and is like, that is not fair. Because he has done so much stuff for these morons. Come on, man. That is not fair. But I wonder two things out loud to you. Number one, is it possible that we would take for granted, as Moses is, the holiness of God? And there's a danger in misrepresenting the holy and the majestic. But by putting ourselves in the seat, it's not helpful to people, even if it might masquerade as helping. And so God does seem to take that really seriously. But I also wonder, and this is the part that I want to find some comfort in, that maybe this is a grace to Moses. I've never asked you to be the guy that starts the ball on the 1 yard line and gets it all the way into the other end zone, right? That's never been the plan. Do your part of the story. And if you read forward, as we're going to, this does appear to be a bit of a turning point for Moses, where he begins to carry differently the power that is working through him, right? And it's hard for us to receive this as a grace, but perhaps there's a grace in Moses just being reminded, you don't have to rescue, but do your part in the story. Do your part. Do the next right thing, Moses and Aaron. You're not going to save them. You're not going to rescue them. And every act of defiance and misbehavior is not a reflection of your poor leadership. Stop absorbing it that way. Trust that I can do a lot with your little, and let me work in the story. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4 talks about this idea that the rock in this story is Jesus. Paul is telling the Corinthian church, hey, it's really hard not to just look at the landscape of Corinth and get sucked into the drama and the nonsense and where love is found and how love is found. But just like the people of Israel were provided for and the rock of Christ was there in their midst, do not fall victim to the belief that life is better back in Egypt and that life is better in these foreign territories, which is something we'll start to talk about in the weeks to come. But that don't neglect the fact that God is right here in your story. We celebrate communion weekly because I have the hunch that you are coming out of a time of desert or you're in one right now. And it becomes really, really easy in the desert days to either be like the Israelites and just like lash out and cry out and trust in all kinds of stuff that cannot deliver our actual thirst, or to have contempt and rage towards the people who are trying to depend on us for things that only God can give them. And communion is this reset, this relationship to the rock. Broken body, shed blood. The rock has been struck, but it wasn't conquered. It's not tapped out of being able to replenish and satisfy you. So as you come to the table and you receive bread and cup, it's a reminder that the God who is wandering with the people in the desert, providing refreshment, whether you are an Israelite or you're Moses or you can find yourself in between, is continuing to walk with you in this journey in your desert days as well. May we receive it. That's the invitation of the Lord's Supper, to receive what's being offered and poured out on behalf of Christ. Let's pray. Let's partake together as we go to one of our 4 stations, and let's continue to let the love of God wash over us and refresh us in our stories. God, it is easy to just do what Moses did and just get so reactive and to miss the beautiful, beautiful invitation that the holy, the divine has stepped near into our story and into our midst. And here we are, trusting in relationships and successes and money and a million other things that cannot deliver what they promise. Lord, help us to receive from you as we walk and wait for the next right step you're calling us to take. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.